Most people think of kimchi as a spicy side dish, something added for flavor, heat, or tradition. What is usually overlooked is that kimchi is not really a food in the usual sense. It is a living system that continues to change long after it is prepared. And its effects on the body are not driven by a single ingredient, but by a slow interaction between microbes, time, and human physiology. The common assumption is that fermented foods are healthy because they contain probiotics. Yet the deeper story is more complex and, in some ways, more restrained. Kimchi does not act quickly, it does not target one organ, and it does not behave the same way in every person. Its relevance to longevity lies in quieter mechanisms that operate over long periods, often below the level of immediate perception. Understanding those mechanisms requires letting go of the idea that more intensity, more spice, or more fermentation automatically means more benefit. Kimchi begins as vegetables, salt, and thyme. At the start, the environment inside the jar is harsh. Salt draws water out of the vegetables, limiting the growth of many microbes. Only certain bacteria can survive. As fermentation progresses, lactic acid bacteria gradually take over, producing organic acids that lower the pH. This shift is not accidental. It is a selective process that favors microbes adapted to acidic, low oxygen conditions. What matters here is not the presence of bacteria alone, but the sequence in which they appear and disappear. Early-stage kimchi and aged kimchi contain very different microbial communities. This means the biological signal sent to the gut is not fixed. Longevity is not influenced by single exposures, but by repeated, consistent inputs that gently shape immune tone, metabolic signaling, and gut barrier function over time. One of the most underestimated aspects of kimchi is that its microbes do not need to permanently colonize the gut to matter. Many people assume probiotics must take up residence to have an effect. In reality, transient microbes can still interact with immune cells lining the intestine, influence short-chain fatty acid production indirectly, and modify how the gut responds to other foods. Kimchi's bacteria act more like visitors that leave instructions behind rather than permanent tenants. This helps explain why fermented foods can have effects even when the specific strains do not persist. Longevity, from this perspective, is not about populating the gut with foreign organisms, but about training existing systems to respond more flexibly and with less chronic activation. Another overlooked element is the role of plant compounds that are transformed during fermentation. Cabbage and other vegetables used in kimchi contain glucosinolates, polyphenols, and fibers that are relatively inert in their raw state. Fermentation alters their structure. Some compounds become more bioavailable. Others are broken down into metabolites that interact with detoxification enzymes and cellular stress pathways. These changes are subtle. They do not create dramatic short-term effects, but over years they may influence how cells handle oxidative stress and inflammation. Longevity is closely tied to the ability to manage low-grade stress without triggering excessive immune or metabolic responses. Kimchi contributes not by suppressing stress, but by gently recalibrating how the body interprets it. Salt is often criticized in discussions about longevity, and kimchi contains salt by necessity. This creates an apparent contradiction. A food associated with health also contains a component often linked to cardiovascular risk. The resolution lies in context. Salt in fermented foods behaves differently than salt added to ultra-processed products. In kimchi, salt is bound within a matrix of fiber, organic acids, and potassium-rich vegetables. This alters absorption dynamics and hormonal responses. Moreover, traditional kimchi is consumed in small portions, integrated into meals rather than eaten in isolation. Longevity is not shaped by individual nutrients removed from their context, but by patterns of eating that balance opposing forces over time. Kimchi also interacts with the gut barrier, a structure that separates the external environment from the internal bloodstream. With age, this barrier can become more permeable, allowing inflammatory molecules to pass through more easily. Fermented foods may help maintain barrier integrity by supporting mucus production and tight junction signaling. This does not mean kimchi seals the gut or repairs damage on its own. Rather, it participates in a broader ecosystem that includes fiber intake, circadian rhythms, and metabolic health. Longevity benefits emerge when multiple small supports align, not when one food is expected to compensate for systemic imbalance. The relationship between kimchi and inflammation is another area often oversimplified. Inflammation is not inherently harmful. It is necessary for repair and defense. Problems arise when inflammation becomes chronic and poorly regulated. The compounds and microbes in kimchi appear to influence signaling pathways that help resolve inflammation rather than suppress it outright. This distinction matters. Longevity depends on maintaining the ability to mount a response and then stand down efficiently. Foods that blunt immune activity indiscriminately may offer short-term comfort but undermine long-term resilience. Kimchi's value lies in modulation, not inhibition. There is also a cultural dimension that indirectly affects longevity. Kimchi is traditionally eaten slowly, shared, and integrated into regular meals. Eating behaviors influence digestion, glucose response, and nervous system activity. While kimchi itself does not slow aging through culture alone, the pattern it belongs to supports regularity and moderation. Longevity research increasingly shows that consistency matters more than intensity. Small daily exposures to supportive inputs accumulate, while sporadic extremes often cancel each other out. It is important to acknowledge that kimchi is not universally beneficial. Some individuals with sensitive digestion, histamine intolerance, or certain gut conditions may react poorly to fermented foods. Longevity is not about forcing the same intervention on every body. It is about identifying inputs that support stability rather than disruption. In this sense, kimchi serves as an example of how traditional foods can align with modern biological understanding when used appropriately. It is not a prescription, but a case study in how slow processes shape long-term outcomes. When viewed through the lens of longevity, kimchi teaches a broader lesson. Health-supporting foods are often misunderstood because their effects are not dramatic. They do not announce themselves with immediate changes. They work quietly through repeated exposure, shaping how systems respond rather than overriding them. Kimchi does not promise extended lifespan. What it offers is a model of interaction between microbes, plants, and human physiology that favors balance over force. Over decades, that difference matters. In the end, kimchi's relevance to longevity is not about spice, trends, or even probiotics as a marketing term. It is about time to ferment, time to consume consistently, and time for small biological adjustments to compound. Longevity is rarely driven by bold interventions. It emerges from environments that reduce unnecessary strain while preserving adaptability. Kimchi, when understood properly, fits into that category. It is not powerful because it does a lot, but because it does just enough, repeatedly, without demanding attention. What often gets missed when discussing longevity is that the body does not age evenly. Different systems drift at different speeds. Metabolic flexibility, immune tolerance, vascular elasticity, and neurological signaling all follow their own timelines. Foods that matter over the long term are the ones that quietly influence several of these systems at once without pushing any of them to extremes. Kimchi fits into this category because it does not act through a single dominant pathway. Instead, it contributes weak signals across multiple networks, and those weak signals, when repeated over years, can shape how aging unfolds. One of the key systems involved is metabolic regulation. As people age, The ability to switch efficiently between fuel sources often declines. This is not usually noticed in daily life, but it contributes to insulin resistance, low-grade inflammation, and energy instability. Fermented vegetables like kimchi are low in available sugars, yet rich in fibers and organic acids. These characteristics slow gastric emptying and influence post-meal metabolic responses. The effect is not dramatic enough to feel, but over time it may reduce repeated metabolic spikes that place strain on regulatory systems. Longevity research increasingly emphasizes reducing variability rather than maximizing performance, and kimchi aligns with that principle. Another subtle mechanism involves the nervous system. The gut and brain are in constant communication through neural, hormonal, and immune pathways. Chronic digestive stress can elevate baseline sympathetic activity, keeping the body in a low-level state of alert. Fermented foods may support parasympathetic tone indirectly by improving digestive efficiency and reducing gut-related immune activation. This does not mean kimchi relaxes the nervous system in an immediate or noticeable way. Instead, it may reduce background noise that accumulates with age and contributes to sleep disruption, fatigue, and impaired recovery. Longevity depends as much on reducing unnecessary activation as it does on enhancing function. The microbial diversity associated with traditional diets is also relevant. Modern eating patterns tend to narrow microbial exposure, leading to ecosystems that are resilient in the short term but fragile over decades. Kimchi introduces variability in microbial signals without overwhelming the system. Each batch differs slightly depending on ingredients, fermentation time, and storage conditions. This variability may help maintain adaptive capacity in the gut ecosystem. Longevity favors systems that remain flexible rather than optimized for a narrow set of conditions. It is also important to understand what kimchi does not do. It does not reset the microbiome. It does not detoxify the body in a meaningful way. It does not compensate for chronic overconsumption, sleep deprivation, or inactivity. Expecting it to do so reflects a misunderstanding of how aging works. Longevity is not reversed. It is shaped. Foods like kimchi influence the slope of change, not the direction. This distinction protects against disappointment and exaggeration, while preserving what is genuinely valuable. Fermentation itself offers a lesson about time and restraint. The process works because conditions are controlled, but not forced. Too much salt stops fermentation. Too little allows spoilage. Temperature matters, but perfection is not required. This mirrors how biological systems age best under conditions that are supportive, but not extreme. Kimchi is a product of balance rather than optimization, and that philosophy aligns closely with what long-term health appears to require. There is also an interaction between fermented foods and immune memory. Repeated exposure to low-level microbial signals may help maintain immune discrimination, the ability to distinguish between threat and noise. With age, this discrimination often degrades, leading to exaggerated responses to minor stimuli. While no single food can preserve immune function indefinitely, consistent dietary inputs that encourage tolerance rather than reactivity may slow this drift. Kimchi contributes to this environment, not by stimulating the immune system, but by reminding it how to respond proportionally. From a longevity perspective, one of the most valuable aspects of kimchi is its role as a replacement rather than an addition. When fermented vegetables displace ultra-processed condiments or refined carbohydrates, the net effect on the body can be meaningful. Longevity benefits often come from what is removed as much as from what is added. Kimchi's strong flavor encourages smaller portions and slower eating, indirectly influencing overall intake. These behavioral effects are rarely acknowledged, yet they compound over time. It is worth noting that traditional kimchi consumption is seasonal and cyclical. This contrasts with the modern idea of constant availability and constant exposure. Periods without fermented foods may be just as important as periods with them. Biological systems evolved under conditions of variation, not continuous stimulation. Longevity may benefit from rhythms that include both exposure and rest. Kimchi, when consumed as part of a varied diet rather than a daily obligation, fits this pattern more naturally. As the body ages, resilience becomes more important than performance. Resilience is the ability to absorb stress without permanent disruption. Foods that support resilience do so quietly, by reinforcing baseline stability rather than producing noticeable effects. Kimchi belongs in this category. Its influence is cumulative, context-dependent, and modest by design. That modesty is precisely why it deserves attention in serious discussions about longevity. When people search for longevity strategies, they often look for leverage points that promise outsized returns. Biology rarely works that way. Most of what extends health span does so by reducing friction within systems that are already functional. Kimchi does not create new capacities. It reduces small inefficiencies that, when left unaddressed for decades, contribute to decline. This is not exciting, but it is realistic. Seeing clearly, kimchi is not a secret or a shortcut. It is an example of how traditional practices align with modern understanding when stripped of mythology. Its relevance to longevity lies in its consistency, its restraint, and its integration into daily life. Over time, those qualities matter more than novelty or intensity. If longevity is the art of staying well rather than becoming exceptional, then kimchi earns its place quietly, without asking to be noticed. As the discussion deepens, it becomes clear that longevity is not just a biological outcome, but a systems outcome. The body is not a collection of independent organs aging in parallel. It is a network of feedback loops that gradually lose coordination. One of the earliest signs of aging is not damage, but desynchronization. Signals arrive too late, responses linger too long, and recovery takes more effort. Foods that support longevity tend to improve coordination rather than amplify output. Kimchi fits this pattern because its influence is distributed and indirect, affecting timing, signaling, and thresholds rather than forcing change. Consider how aging affects appetite and satiety. With time, hormonal signals that regulate hunger and fullness often become less precise. People eat faster, overshoot satiety, or experience delayed feedback from meals. Fermented foods may subtly influence this process through organic acids and sensory intensity. Kimchi's strong taste encourages smaller bites and slower pacing, which gives satiety signals time to register. This is not a conscious intervention, but a structural one. Longevity benefits often arise from environments that make healthier behaviors easier without relying on willpower. Another layer involves oxidative stress, a concept frequently misunderstood. Oxidative stress is not simply damage caused by reactive molecules. It is also a signaling mechanism that helps cells adapt. Problems arise when signaling becomes excessive or poorly resolved. The compounds produced during fermentation, along with transformed plant antioxidants, appear to support regulatory pathways that help cells respond proportionally to stress. This does not eliminate oxidative processes, nor should it. Longevity depends on maintaining responsiveness while avoiding chronic overload. Kimchi contributes to this balance not by neutralizing stress, but by refining how stress is handled. There is also an important distinction between stimulation and nourishment. Many modern health strategies rely on stimulation, pushing systems to perform or adapt rapidly. This can be effective in the short term, but often accelerates wear. Kimchi does not stimulate aggressively. Its effects are slow and cumulative. It nourishes processes that already exist rather than demanding new ones. This is consistent with longevity research, showing that slower, steadier interventions tend to preserve function longer than intense but short-lived strategies. The role of the liver in aging is another subtle point. The liver is central to metabolic regulation, detoxification, and immune signaling. Over time, its workload increases due to dietary excess, environmental exposure, and metabolic inefficiency. Fermented foods may reduce some of this burden indirectly by improving digestion upstream and modifying bile acid metabolism through gut-liver signaling. Again, the effect is not dramatic or immediate. It is a small reduction in background strain that compounds over years. Longevity often depends on preserving organ reserve rather than enhancing peak capacity. Social and environmental stability also interact with diet in ways that affect aging. Kimchi is traditionally part of a predictable meal structure, eaten regularly but not excessively. Predictability itself supports circadian alignment, digestive enzyme timing, and hormonal rhythms. Irregular eating patterns, even with high-quality foods, can disrupt these systems. Its place within structured meals may be as important as its biochemical properties. Longevity is shaped by patterns, not isolated inputs. It is tempting to frame longevity as a collection of hacks, but this framing misses the deeper reality. Aging is shaped by friction. Friction in metabolism, friction in immune signaling, friction in recovery. Foods that reduce friction rarely feel powerful, but they matter precisely because they do not demand attention. Kimchi reduces friction by supporting microbial communication, digestive efficiency, and regulatory balance. It does not override biology. It cooperates with it. As research continues, it is likely that fermented foods will be understood less as probiotic delivery systems and more as modulators of signaling environments. This shift matters because it moves the focus away from strains and supplements and toward processes and context. Kimchi is valuable not because it contains specific microbes, but because it represents a controlled interaction between food, time, and biology. Longevity favors systems that respect these interactions rather than attempting to bypass them. In practical terms, kimchi's relevance to longevity lies in its role as a steady presence rather than a focal point. It does not need to be consumed daily, nor does it need to be emphasized. Its benefits emerge when it is part of a broader pattern that includes whole foods, regular meals, adequate rest, and moderate intake. When isolated or exaggerated, it loses its meaning. Longevity is not built from extremes, even when those extremes are traditionally healthy. Ultimately, kimchi serves as a reminder that the most effective longevity strategies often look ordinary. They are embedded in daily life, culturally transmitted, and biologically modest. They do not promise transformation. They support continuity. Over long spans of time, continuity is what preserves function. Kimchi does not slow aging in a visible way. It supports the conditions under which aging proceeds with less disruption. That distinction is subtle, but it is the difference between chasing health and sustaining it. When viewed without mythology or exaggeration, kimchi becomes less impressive and more credible. Its value lies not in what it adds dramatically, but in what it quietly supports. In the context of longevity, that quiet support is exactly what matters. At the longest timescale, longevity is about preserving decision-making inside the body. Young systems respond with precision. Older systems respond with delay, overshoot, or confusion. Blood sugar rises higher and falls faster. Inflammation lingers after it is no longer useful. Recovery takes longer than the original stress. These shifts are not failures. They are the cumulative result of small mismatches that were never corrected. Foods that matter over decades are the ones that slightly improve calibration. Kimchi belongs here because it nudges systems toward proportion rather than intensity. One of the most important but least discussed aspects of aging is signal resolution. It is not enough to activate a response. The response must also end at the right time. Many age-related conditions involve signals that stay on too long. Immune activation, stress hormones, digestive responses all persist beyond their usefulness. Fermented foods appear to influence signaling shutdown as much as signaling initiation. The organic acids, microbial metabolites, and altered fibers in kimchi interact with receptors that help determine when a response has done its job. This is not a cure for dysregulation, but it may reduce the frequency with which systems get stuck in the on position. Another element is redundancy. Healthy systems have multiple overlapping ways to maintain balance. Aging reduces redundancy, leaving fewer options when one pathway fails. Diets built around variety and fermentation tend to preserve more routes of regulation. Kimchi does not provide a single dominant signal. It provides many weak ones. Weak signals are often dismissed because they are hard to measure, but in biology they are what maintain flexibility. Longevity depends less on strength and more on options. There is also the question of effort. Many interventions aimed at health span require increasing effort with age, stricter rules, tighter control. This often backfires. Strategies that rely on constant vigilance tend to collapse under real life. Kimchi does not require effort once it is part of a routine. It does not demand tracking, timing, or optimization. Longevity strategies that persist are usually the ones that disappear into daily life. This is not a philosophical point. It is a practical one grounded in adherence and sustainability. Over time, the body also becomes more sensitive to extremes. Very spicy foods, very acidic foods, very large portions can become harder to tolerate. Kimchi's traditional use respects this. It is intense in flavor, but small in quantity. This allows sensory satisfaction without physiological overload. Longevity favors inputs that provide feedback without strain. Kimchi delivers contrast rather than volume, which becomes increasingly important as regulatory margins narrow with age. It is useful to step back and notice what is not being claimed. Kimchi does not extend lifespan on its own. It does not override genetics. It does not protect against all disease. What it does is contribute to an environment in which biological systems operate with slightly less friction. Over decades, that matters. Longevity is not built from dramatic interventions, but from the absence of repeated small harms. When traditional foods like kimchi are examined through modern science, their value often turns out to be structural rather than pharmacological. They shape timing, pacing, signaling, and context. They encourage moderation without instruction. They support regulation without force. Kimchi's relevance to longevity lies here. It is not an agent of change. It is a stabilizer. If there's a single lesson to take from kimchi, it is that aging well depends on respecting slow processes. Fermentation cannot be rushed without losing its character. Neither can biological adaptation. Longevity emerges when inputs are compatible with time rather than opposed to it. Kimchi aligns with time. It changes slowly, it is consumed slowly, and it influences the body slowly. In that sense, kimchi is less a superfood and more a quiet agreement with biology. An agreement to work with existing systems instead of trying to dominate them. Over a lifetime, that agreement may be one of the most realistic foundations for sustained health.